Welcome to DebtCircle Sundown Brief for 13th May 2026. I'm Leela, and here are today's key developments across India's debt and fixed income markets. Let's begin with the top 5 highest yield listed corporate bonds. Navi Finserv Limited reported a yield of 19.46% with a trade value of 0.20 lakh rupees. Another issuance from Navi Finserv Limited reported a yield of 17.56% with a trade value of 0.20 lakh rupees. Kirtana Finserv Limited reported a yield of 17.19% with a trade value of 0.18 lakh rupees. Midland Microfin Limited reported a yield of 15.92% with a trade value of 0.20 lakh rupees. Unifins Capital India Limited reported a yield of 15.50% with a trade value of 56.60 lakh rupees. Moving to the top 5 highest yield unlisted corporate bonds. Apex Homes Private Limited reported a yield of 14.00% with a trade value of 3,534.27 lakh rupees. Cholamandalam Investment and Finance Company Limited reported a yield of 9.32% with a trade value of 5.00 lakh rupees. Nuvama Wealth Finance Limited reported a yield of 9.00% with a trade value of 20.00 lakh rupees. Anand Rathi Global Finance Limited reported a yield of 7.50% with a trade value of 8.00 lakh rupees. Another issuance from Anand Rathi Global Finance Limited reported a yield of 7.50% with a trade value of 200.00 lakh rupees. Now moving to mutual fund debt transactions. Gross purchases stood at 11,829.06 crore rupees. Gross sales stood at 17,637.93 crore rupees. Net investment stood at negative 5,808.87 crore rupees. Net investment for May month to date stood at negative 26,249.750 crore rupees. Moving to FPI debt market investments. Under the general limit category, gross purchases stood at 289.04 crore rupees. Under VRR, gross purchases stood at 0.00 crore rupees. Under FAR, gross purchases stood at 1,183.38 crore rupees. Under the general limit category, gross sales stood at 60.62 crore rupees. Under VRR, gross sales stood at 125.72 crore rupees. Under FAR, gross sales stood at 1,074.39 crore rupees. Net investment under the general limit category stood at 228.42 crore rupees. Net investment under VRR stood at negative 125.72 crore rupees. Net investment under FAR stood at 108.99 crore rupees. Net investment for May month to date stood at negative 180.89 crore rupees under the general limit category. Under VRR, month to date net investment stood at 1,163.87 crore rupees. Under FAR, month to date net investment stood at 4,165.39 crore rupees. For calendar year 2026 year to date, net investment under the general limit category stood at negative 3,476 crore rupees. Under VRR, year-to-date net investment stood at negative 240 crore rupees. Under FAR, year-to-date net investment stood at 14,373 crore rupees. Now to money market rates. Call rate stood at 5.24%, T-repo stood at 5.08%, basket repo stood at 5.15%, special repo stood at 5.00%. India government bond yields were as follows: 1 year at 5.91%, 3 year at 6.41%, 5 year at 6.83%, 7 year at 6.97%, 9 year at 6.92%, 10 year at 7.05%, 15 year at 7.37%, 30 year at 7.62%. Moving to Treasury bill yields and auction cutoffs. 91-day Treasury bill stood at 5.29%, 182-day Treasury bill stood at 5.50%. 364-day Treasury bill stood at 5.69%. Now to liquidity indicators. Net liquidity injected stood at negative 2,65,146 crore rupees. Standing deposit facilities stood at 0 crore rupees. Marginal standing facilities stood at 287 crore rupees. Moving to MIBOR OIS rates. 1 year stood at 6.06%, 2 years stood at 6.28%, 3 years stood at 6.44%, 5 years stood at 6.66%. Modified MIFOR rates were as follows: 2 year at 7.00%, 3 year at 7.03%, 4 year at 7.19%, 5 year at 0.00%. Now to currency rates. US dollar to Indian rupee closed at 95.67 compared to the previous close of 95.63. Euro to Indian rupee closed at 112.08 compared to the previous close of 112.31. British pound to Indian rupee closed at 129.25 compared to the previous close of 129.39. Japanese yen to Indian rupee closed at 0.61, unchanged from the previous close of 0.61. Chinese yuan to Indian rupee closed at 14.08 compared to the previous close of 14.06. Moving to commodities and market indices. Gold 24 carat, 99.9% purity, stood at 16,200 rupees per gram compared to the previous level of 15,398 rupees. Silver stood at 3,100 rupees per 10 grams compared to the previous level of 2,900 rupees. Crude oil stood at $107.64 per barrel compared to the previous level of $107.91 per barrel. The Sensex closed at 74,608.98 compared to the previous close of 74,559.24. The Nifty closed at 23,412.60 compared to the previous close of 23,379.55. Finally, moving to India primary issuance in corporate bonds. Poonawalla Fincorp Limited announced an issuance of 1,000 crore rupees with a tenure of 25 months and a coupon of 8.25%, rated AAA by CRISIL Ratings Limited. IIFL Samastha Finance Limited announced an issuance of 25 crore rupees with a tenure of 121 months and a coupon of 9.35%, rated AA by India Rating and Research Private Limited and AA by Infomerics Valuation and Rating Private Limited. Ambium Finserv Limited announced an issuance of 20 crore rupees with a tenure of 19 months and a coupon of 11.16%. That was your DebtCircle Sundown brief for 13th May 2026. Thank you for watching. I'm Leela. Stay informed and have a great evening.